Madam President, thank you for acknowledging my need to just make a short intervention on the motion before us. A motion to borrow $6 million from the African Export-Import Bank to finance the construction of social infrastructure and other facilities damaged or destroyed by Tropical Storm Brett under an education rehabilitation climate-linked facility. And so I want to start off, Madam President, by stating categorically my support for the motion before us. And of course, not just specifically in terms of the motion, but the thrust of the government of the day to make some timely interventions as it relates to education in this country. I would assume, Madam President, that an intervention as it relates to education, as it relates to intervention in the education sector, would obviously be something that is welcoming by right-thinking men and women of this country, understanding the importance of education in any particular country, and of course St. Lucia is no exception to that. Of course, I sometimes wonder why I keep being surprised sometimes by the things I hear uttered in corridors that, in my opinion, should be corridors of intelligent thought, intelligent conversation, and intelligent discourse. And I always, and I will always continue to say that whereas we may think that there are people not listening to us, there are people in this country who listen, sometimes with bated breath, to hear the quality of discourse that comes from certain institutions, certain corridors, certain places where they expect that they will leave perhaps with a better understanding of what the issues are, a better understanding of how we arrive at solutions to the problems that confront us as a small country. But sometimes I come out short. And I am trying very much to learn, and it's something I share with my friends all the time, that a lot of the times our disappointments come from the expectations that we have up front. But that is not me saying that we should not continue to have expectations, Madam President. And so I just want to focus on a few things. Again, to say that I support the level of infrastructure development, the level of repairs and so on that will be undertaken in our school plans. And of course, the conversation about damaged school plans and inadequate resources allocated to schools, it's an age-old argument that I do not think we will ever get to the point where we do away with it. But here is the funny thing, Madam President, is that it is not isolated to just that. As we go on a regular basis, and those of us who manage households, I don't know if all of us here manage households, but those of us who manage households, I think that there is a clear understanding that at any point in time, no matter what allocation you set aside for particular things, there are particular events that will happen, whether it is internal, whether it is external, things that will happen that will inevitably affect the way you are able to manage that prior allocation. And so I have heard so many times the age-old argument of it was $1 million that was allocated, measly amount allocated to the repair of schools. The question is, when will what amount be enough to allocate to whether it is schools, to allocate to whether it is healthcare? When will it ever be enough? When from very, very young you learn that these dynamics are forever changing, and so cost and cost implications and changes in costs and so on, that this is a moving target. And so of course we understand that if in one particular year 1 million was allocated, we do the assessment and we evaluate that it was woefully inadequate. It is incumbent on the government of the day, whichever forms the next government, to now come back, review, reevaluate and decide it was not adequate. Let us add more, let us reallocate, let us re-engineer. Let us use what we have smarter. And I think I agree with Senator Daniel when he indicated that sometimes we look at the price tag, we look at the millions and the zeros, and we say, well, it is inadequate. But is it really the answer to the questions? Can we look at the same 1 million, reallocate it, use it smarter rather than add more to it? Madam President. And as a parent, it is something that I am challenged to do on a regular basis in my household. That I have to let my 15-year-old son understand that I may not always be able to add a 20 US or a 30 US to the cost of your shoe next year. But perhaps you need to look at the way in which you use the resources that you have. And how could you now ensure that it is used in a manner where you're more fiscally responsible, in a manner where you're able to manage it better so that it can last longer rather than we constantly dishing out more money to fix things. Where do you end when you do that, Madam President? And I think that as we discussed, like I said before, that we need to be able to evoke that level of consciousness within our people, that the answer to the soul, that the answers to the problems is not always adding more zeros and more money, but in about really thinking about how we re-engineer and repurpose and re-strategize what we have available. And it is no wonder that we have some of the social ills that we have, because what we teach our people is, instead of being at a position where you perhaps satisfied with what you have and manage it differently, we constantly push them to get more, and sometimes get more means to steal from the other person. Sometimes get more means to take from the other person, and that is not always the answer to that. And Madam President, I just want to take perhaps a little trip down memory lane. And I agree the infrastructure is important. And I think I sort of heard the juxtaposition from the other side. In one breath, we talk about the plants and so on. And then in the next breath, thankfully, we're able to catch ourselves and say that it is more than just the plant. I live in the community of Vigier, and I attended the Deriso Combined School. If anybody knows this area very, very well, on a daily basis, I walked up a hill and crossed a river. And for years, Madam President, there was not even a bridge across that river. As a child going to the Deriso Combined School, I jumped stones. I jumped on stones when this bridge was down. Again, history speaks for itself. The constituency that I live in has always been a constituency who has voted the Senatorial Labour Party, and maybe that answers some of the questions. But I jumped stones. I remember the principal, teacher Sheila, on many an occasion, especially during the heavy rains, would pass around if a circular and call the children from Vigier children, because it's about to rain or it's raining. We have to leave home early and leave the school early and go home before the river overflows its banks. And I'm pretty sure the leader of government business can attest to the fact that there were times we crossed in rivers that were gushing down. That's how I went to school. But did that prevent me from learning? Did that prevent me from learning? In fact, Madam President, what it did is that it taught me, and it is something that I've passed on to my children, that in times of adversity, you put your back to the wheel and you do what you must to ensure that does not happen. And so I am very, very grateful that now my 9-year-old daughter, I could stay at my mother's house and see the top of the school at Vigier Primary, thanks to a Senatorial Labour Party government. That when I leave home at 7 o'clock in the morning, I know that my daughter does not have to jump stones. And these are the strides that we've made when it comes to school. But again, to make the point, Madam President, that the physical conditions that I was in at the time, and many of us at Vigier either walked to Deriso or walked to Piero Combined School to go to school, it did not prevent many of us from learning, because we understood that we were in a place. Unfortunately, we didn't put ourselves there, but we needed to move, we needed to do better, we needed to grow. And so, whereas a lot of children walk to Mikud Secondary School, for example, down the Canal Road to go to school, many of them now can enjoy boarding a bus and going to the secondary schools. And so, again, to say that sometimes the physical conditions that we focus so greatly on, yes, it is important, but it's not the know-it-all in terms of education and being able to deliver quality education in the school. And we have to teach our children these things. I had a lot of other things touted around the room. And again, the whole issue of scholarships, Madam President, and maybe today it's a bit of nostalgic for me. I was also a scholarship child. I received a scholarship from the National Community Foundation when I entered secondary school. And there are times when I sit and I wonder, where would I have been today if perhaps I was not part of that cohort of students who were given the opportunity to get a scholarship to attend a secondary school. Fortunately, some of us sit around here and we can easily fund, whether it is through the silting of rivers, whether it is through genuine work, whether it is through our government salaries at the end of the month, whatever the case may be, we can send our children to school comfortably. But the reality is a lot of people in this country for years have not been able to do that. And so when you hear people trivialize scholarships and so on, of course we understand that we are in a space where we will not be able to afford to give every child a scholarship. But when you speak about provision of scholarships in that manner, the children who actually it mattered to them, people like me, was able to go to school on a full scholarship. And I remember leaving secondary school, being in Form 5, and all my classmates were in the principal's office and in the bursar's office, filling in application forms for tertiary education. And I couldn't. An A student at Beaufort Comprehensive Secondary School, I couldn't, because I knew for a fact that my parents just could not afford. And yes, I told the white lies then to my classmates, I'm not ready to go back to school. I'll work for a little while. Blatant lie. I could not go. I was ashamed to say that I could not go. Thankfully, I remember getting that call when many of my other classmates had actually started orientation for school, and the NCF indicated to me that I'd gotten an extension for 2 more years to go to a tertiary level education. It was at that point I remember calling the A-level department and saying that I want to apply. Thankfully, my CXC grades allowed me almost free entry into the school, and I'm grateful for that. And so when you speak about scholarships in that manner, it doesn't matter if it's the one, because there were 2 of us who got extended that period, but the 2 of us, it means, got an opportunity to now be citizens of this country who can now contribute to to discourse, contribute to ensuring that other people. And so I have made it my life's journey not to be able to just sit down comfortably and say, well, my children can go to school. On a regular yearly basis, I ensure that it doesn't matter how much dry bread I have to eat. I heard one of the members on the other side talk about the banana and the whatever. And I love bananas. I eat bananas, and sometimes it is the answer to me being able to provide a notebook and a pencil to another child, because I'm grateful of the opportunity that I was given. And so we need not trivialize these things. Whether it's 1 or 2 who's able to get a scholarship, we have to applaud these efforts, because these are the children who will inevitably carry us through in terms of this country. Madam President, I saw an attempt to listen and learn. But I know the concept of learning can be a very, very broad concept, because listening and learning is about hearing, but about also being able to analyze and decipher what was heard. And then there has been a constant trajectory to water down particular things and introduce things that may not even necessarily be in keeping with anything that is on the table. And so we had a long, drawn-out discussion about how many schools fall in the opposition parliamentarian, the opposition constituencies, and so on. And of course, we have to perhaps, just for a little while, and I don't want to spend much time on it, understand where that comes from. This comes from a place where, in the previous administration, it was not just he say or she say. It was a culmination of activities, a culmination of behaviors that affected persons in constituencies like where I live in Beaufort North, where it was not just a case of where things were not being done, After we felt so blatant about it, We defined a term for it to define what it meant that 6 constituencies would not, the constituents of these constituencies would not enjoy the same benefits of government resources with the other 11. That is the reality of what existed. And so I do not find it strange now that perhaps we want to take the position of justifying that we're doing things in opposition constituencies now, because the cry of the people were on the ground. You cannot forget these things. I cannot forget, Madam President, sitting in a constituency where a road was being done from one part of the constituency to the next. More than 50% of the road was completed under the SLP administration. And then when the UWP administration came in, they forgot about the rest of the road. The senator on the other side, Senator Charles, she mentioned her constituency when she went to Bellevue. But back in the day, it meant that she drove that very road to go to Bellevue, from Grace to go to Bellevue, in a road that the government she sat on would have refused to complete the road because they would make us suffer. That's what it was. They would make us suffer for it. And in communities, even her specific community, I remember areas like Back Street in Grace, where the contracts were already signed for these community roads to be done. And then these contracts were taken away from the people. Madam President, that's the reality of what exists. And so maybe now we want to walk the floor and talk about that. We are doing exactly what we spoke about that they didn't do. Ensure that the resources of the country, whether it is for school repair, whether it is for any other thing, it is adequately spent and adequately accounted for across the length of and breadth of St. Lucia. Because the children who sit in these school plans, the children who are expected to learn within these walls, they come from every nook and cranny of St. Lucia. And if not for anything else but for the children of St. Lucia, we need to ensure that when we are expending government resources, that we do not leave people out. And I think as well that Senator Daniel touched on something that I wanted to point out that came out in the discussion in terms of unforeseen circumstances. And again, I get to this point where I started, that there is an expectation that the discourse that happens at levels such as these within the country must seek to inform our people, especially our young people who are looking up to us, to understand particular concepts. That you budget for something, for example, you get up in the morning and you had no intention to go to the doctor, but you broke a fall this morning after you got out of your bed. Do you say, well, mate budget poorly we doctor, so you're just going to let yourself bleed out? Or do you now determine where do you now get the monies, where do you now take the resources to be able to seek medical attention? And it may be at the expense of something else, but it's required at the time and unforeseen circumstances. And so we have to be careful what we dish out there. Madam President, I do look forward to these infrastructural works being undertaken at the schools. Again, to say that it will be a constant thing, that things will change, different ideas will emerge on a global scale sometimes as well, that will help us see that perhaps what we feel is adequate in terms of school and curriculums and infrastructure for schools are not adequate, and so we need to add on and we need to improve. And it will be something that will always need to happen, and it is the responsibility of the government of the day to ensure that this is done. All the other advice that was given in terms of all the other add-ons, because we understand that the school plan cannot exist on its own, I think these things are adequate. But I challenge, Madam President, and it is perhaps something I've thrown out to Senator Charles before, that whilst we, and I know it was said maybe about last week or so, that issue was raised on a platform in terms of some of the schools that did not have adequate food and the food was spoiled and so on. What are we as concerned citizens doing about these situations that present themselves in our communities? What are we doing about them? And I said before that I have made it almost my life's journey to ensure that, especially when it comes to education, if there is an issue and the principal at the Vijay Primary School calls me make myself available, and I can say that I will do it long after my child has left the corridor of that school, because I understand the change in the physical landscape and the psychological landscape that that school has had on the community. And so when I can, where I can, I chip in. I don't mind pushing my hand in my pocket if there is no chicken in the school and say, well, this is what I can put on the table. At what point do we as leaders now try to now spread this type of community engagement amongst our people, rather than sit down and lament the fact that government whatever, whilst we sit comfortable in our homes, and we feel comfortable that our children are fed, but we know the ills that exist, we know the children that are going without. What are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? And I think that this is a constant thing in terms of the opposition. And just quickly, not to dwell on it, the issue of the little houses that were built for people and so on. And so I've thought about it, and I've tried to figure out.
Senator, I think I've given you some latitude. I think you should stick to it.
Thank you, Madam President. But, Madam President, to make the point that, one, like I indicated, that I support the motion before us, but two, that we should and we can do more in terms of we as leaders in this country, rather than dwelling on the little things that we feel needs to be fixed and needs to be fixed now. We have to ask ourselves the bigger question in terms of what we can do to complement what the government is doing, and to give due praise where the praise is due, to ensure that these wheels of motion continue to move for the benefit of the people in our country, Madam President. Thank you.